The producers wanted her gone. Simon Cowell stood up and said no. The studio fell into a silence so deep you could hear hearts beating. Simon Cowell, the man known for crushing dreams with a single word, did something no one in that theater had ever seen before. He turned off his microphone, stood up from the judge's table, and walked toward the stage. Not to deliver a verdict. Not to offer criticism. But to protect someone the show wanted to eliminate. What happened in the next 7 minutes would change everything anyone thought they knew about Simon Cowell. Subscribe now, because what Simon did next will restore your faith in humanity. Her name was Margaret. 52 years old, a hospice nurse from Ohio who had raised 3 children alone after her husband died in a factory accident. She worked double shifts, missed school plays, and watched her own aspirations dissolve into the relentless machinery of survival. But Margaret had a voice. A voice that, according to her late husband, could make angels stop and listen. He used to tell her she should sing professionally. She would laugh it off, reminding him that bills don't pay themselves and dreams don't feed children. 23 years after his death, holding a letter he had written before he died, a letter she only discovered 6 months ago hidden in an old toolbox, Margaret finally made the decision. The letter said, "If you're reading this, I'm gone. But please, Maggie, don't let me take your voice with me. Sing." Not for me. For you. So she auditioned for America's Got Talent. Not because she wanted fame, but because a man she loved had asked her to. She made it through the preliminary rounds. But then, 48 hours before her scheduled performance, a producer called her hotel room. The message was cold and final. "We're going in a different direction. Your slot has been reassigned." Margaret sat on that hotel bed, letter in hand, and wept. Not because of the rejection, but because she had finally found the courage to honor her husband's wish, and it still wasn't enough. But here's what the producers didn't know. Simon Cowell had already seen her audition tape. Late one night, reviewing footage, he stumbled across Margaret's preliminary audition. She sang Hallelujah. But not the version everyone knows. She sang it the way someone sings when they've lived through every word. Simon stopped the tape. Rewound it. Played it again. Then he asked his assistant to find out who this woman was and why he hadn't been told about her. The answer came back. She had been scheduled but was being cut. The producers felt she didn't fit the narrative arc. Translation: she wasn't young enough, dramatic enough, or marketable enough. Simon made a single phone call. Put her back on the roster. Tonight. The producers resisted. The schedule was locked. Simon's response was short. Then I'm not judging tonight. Margaret had no idea. She was packing when the hotel phone rang again. There's been a reconsideration. You're back on for tonight. She almost said no. But then she looked at the letter. Sing. For you. So she went. Backstage, a stage manager approached her. Just so you know, there's been some disagreement about your slot. Some people don't think you should be here. Then why am I? The stage manager hesitated. Because Simon Cowell said you are. The host's voice boomed. Please welcome Margaret Anderson from Ohio. She walked onto that stage like she was walking to the edge of a cliff. Simon leaned forward, arms crossed. So, Margaret, tell us why you're here. She looked at the letter in her hand. My husband died 23 years ago. Before he passed, he wrote me a letter. I only found it 6 months ago. He asked me to sing. So I'm here to keep a promise. Simon's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. The music started. Margaret closed her eyes, held the letter against her chest, and sang. Her voice filled the theater. It wasn't technically perfect. But it was real. It was human. It was the sound of someone who had lived every word. The audience went silent. Not polite silence, but breathless silence. Simon uncrossed his arms. His face softened. And then, halfway through the second verse, a producer's voice came through the judge's earpieces. Cut her. We're running long. Simon's jaw tightened. He pressed the button connecting him to production. No. The voice came back, insistent. Simon, we don't have time. Simon didn't respond. He reached up, pulled the earpiece out, and set it on the table. Then he stood up. The other judges looked at him, confused. The audience murmured. Margaret, still singing, opened her eyes and saw Simon Cowell standing, staring directly at her. The producer in the booth was yelling, but Simon couldn't hear him. And he didn't care. Margaret finished. The final note dissolved into silence. Then the audience erupted. A standing ovation. Heidi had tears streaming down her face. Sophia was clapping with both hands over her heart. Howie stood up, visibly moved. But Simon didn't clap. He just stood there, looking at Margaret. Margaret waited for the verdict she knew was coming. Simon picked up his microphone. Margaret, I need to tell you something. The audience quieted. 2 days ago, the producers called you and told you that you weren't going to perform. Do you remember that? Margaret nodded, confused. I want you to know something. That decision didn't come from me. In fact, I fought to have you put back on the stage. Because I saw your audition tape. And I knew you belonged here. The audience gasped. But here's what I also want you to know. There are people in this industry who will try to decide for you whether you're good enough. And I'm telling you right now, in front of everyone watching, that those people are wrong. Margaret's face crumpled. 23 years of grief and suppressed hope came flooding out. Simon set the microphone down. Then he did something he has never done before. He walked around the judge's desk, stepped onto the stage, and walked directly toward Margaret. The audience lost their minds. This wasn't scripted. This was Simon Cowell walking onto that stage to stand beside someone he believed in. He stopped in front of her. May I? He asked, gesturing to the letter. She handed it to him, hands shaking. Simon read it in silence, then folded it back and returned it. Your husband was right. The world deserves to hear your voice. And I'm not going to let anyone take that away from you. He walked back to the desk and said 2 words. You're through. For yes. But it didn't matter. The decision had already been made the moment Simon stood up. Margaret collapsed onto the stage, sobbing. The audience chanted her name. Backstage, after the cameras stopped, Simon found Margaret alone in a hallway. Thank you, she said. Simon shook his head. Don't thank me. You earned this. Why did you fight for me? Simon hesitated, then sat down beside her. Because I've spent my career telling people no. But every once in a while, someone walks onto that stage who reminds me why I started doing this. You're one of those people. He stood up. Your husband was a smart man. He knew what he had. Don't ever let anyone convince you otherwise. The episode aired 3 weeks later. Within hours, the clip went viral. Millions of views turned into tens of millions. Margaret's journey became one of the most watched storylines in the show's history. She made it to the semi-finals. She didn't win, but when she walked off that stage for the final time, she wasn't defeated. She was free. After the show, Margaret was offered a recording contract with a small independent company. She recorded an album that reached the people who needed to hear it: hospice workers, single parents, people navigating grief while still trying to find reasons to sing. Simon never spoke publicly about that night beyond one interview. People think I'm harsh because I enjoy it. The truth is, I'm harsh because mediocrity is everywhere, and real talent is rare. When you find someone genuine, you protect it. Margaret had that. The journalists pressed. Why her? Why that moment? Because she reminded me why I fell in love with music. She sang like someone who had something to say. And that's the rarest thing you can find. The clip has been viewed over 200 million times. But what most people don't know is what happened 6 months later. Simon received a handwritten letter from Margaret's daughter. What you did for my mother changed her life. Not because of the show, but because for the first time in 23 years, she stopped feeling guilty for being happy. Thank you for seeing her when the rest of the world wanted to look away. Simon kept that letter in his desk drawer. On days when the industry felt too cynical, he would take it out and read it again. Because moments like these don't just change the people on stage. They change the people watching. And sometimes, they even change the person holding the buzzer. Margaret still performs. Small venues, charity events, hospice fundraisers. She's not chasing fame. She's doing what her husband asked. She's singing for herself. And Simon? He still judges with the same intensity. But every once in a while, when someone walks onto that stage with something real, he remembers Margaret. He remembers what it feels like to fight for someone who deserves a chance. Because the most revolutionary thing you can do is recognize the truth when you see it. And protect it, even when everyone else wants to cut to commercial. In the weeks following that performance, something unexpected began to happen across the country. Emails flooded the America's Got Talent production offices. Not complaints about production decisions or requests for behind-the-scenes footage. These were different. They were letters from people who had given up on their own dreams, who had been told by gatekeepers in their industries that they weren't good enough, that they didn't fit the mold, that they should accept their place and stop reaching for more. A 58-year-old teacher from Michigan wrote that she had been writing poetry for 30 years but never shared it with anyone because a college professor once told her she lacked the necessary depth. After watching Margaret's story, she submitted her work to a literary magazine for the first time. It was accepted. A 42-year-old mechanic from Texas who played guitar in his garage every night after work, but never performed publicly because his father told him, "Real men don't waste time on music," booked his first open mic night. He played 3 songs. The venue asked him to come back. A 35-year-old accountant who had dreamed of opening a bakery but convinced herself it was too late, too risky, too impractical, gave notice at her firm. 6 months later, her small bakery in Seattle had a waiting list for custom cakes. These weren't coincidences. These were ripples. Margaret's story had given people permission to try. Simon received some of these letters. His assistant would occasionally forward ones that specifically mentioned his intervention. He rarely responded, but he read every single one. And on particularly difficult days, when the entertainment industry felt more like a business of manufactured emotions than genuine artistry, he would remember why that moment mattered. It wasn't about television ratings or viral clips or even about Margaret herself. It was about what happens when someone in power decides that protecting authenticity is more important than maintaining a production schedule. It was about proving that the system could be challenged, that the gatekeepers could be overruled, that sometimes the people who aren't supposed to fit are exactly the people we need to hear from most. Margaret's story also changed something within the America's Got Talent production itself. Not immediately, and not dramatically, but subtly, meaningfully. Producers became more cautious about cutting acts based solely on demographics or marketability. There were more conversations about, "Is this person genuinely talented?" rather than, "Will this person test well with focus groups?" The change wasn't universal, and it didn't solve every problem with how talent competitions operate. But it created cracks in a system that had become too comfortable with making decisions based on formulas rather than instinct, on algorithms rather than authenticity. One producer, the same one who had tried to cut Margaret's performance mid-song, later admitted in an industry interview, "That night taught me something I had forgotten. We're not just making television. We're giving people a platform to be seen. And sometimes the person who doesn't fit the plan is exactly the person who deserves that platform most." Simon never commented publicly on that producer's statement. But those who knew him said he smiled when he read it. Years from now, when people look back at the defining moments of Simon Cowell's career, they won't just remember the harsh critiques or the dramatic rejections or even the golden buzzer moments that went viral. They'll remember the night he stood up from that judge's desk, pulled out his earpiece, and walked onto a stage to protect someone the industry wanted to erase. They'll remember that moment not because it was shocking, but because it was human. Because it proved that even in an industry built on spectacle and manufactured drama, there are still people who believe that talent matters more than trends, that authenticity matters more than algorithms, and that sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to let someone be silenced. Margaret's husband never got to see her sing on that stage. He never got to witness the standing ovation, the viral moment, the way his words written decades ago would inspire millions of people he would never meet. But in a way, he was there. In the letter Margaret held against her chest. In the promise she kept. In the voice she finally allowed the world to hear. And Simon Cowell, the man who built a reputation on crushing dreams, became the person who made sure that voice wasn't silenced. Not by producers, not by schedules, not by an industry that too often values convenience over courage. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to remember that their voice matters. Subscribe and leave a comment, because there are more stories like this, stories of people who refused to be silenced, and the unexpected allies who stood up for them when it mattered most. Stories that remind us why humanity, compassion, and standing up for what's right will always matter more than any television schedule.